Let's look at the accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian Defense. I played a game as white. We started with the Sicilian Defense. I played knight f3. Now, we played the accelerated dragon, but first I want to show you the ordinary dragon variation, which begins with d6, d4, pawns get traded on d4, and when that happens, this is called the open Sicilian. And there are many different variations of the open Sicilian. In this particular position, there are several moves you might think to make as black, but very often black makes the move knight to f6. The reason is black wants to put pressure on the e4 pawn early to induce white to play knight to c3 to guard it. And black's point is if he can get the white knight on c3, that blocks in the white c-pawn. So the c-pawn cannot move forward, which is sometimes useful. Okay, and this is how the dragon variation begins. And then after knight c3, black plays g6. Okay, and this is the dragon. The dragon variation occurs when black wants to fianchetto this bishop in the Sicilian. In this game, we played what's called the accelerated dragon variation, and the game went knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and g6 right here. So it's called the accelerated dragon because g6 is played earlier in the opening. Now, in the Sicilian Defense, very often when my opponent allows me to play c4, I like to do it. And I did it here, and this is called the Maroczy Bind. Okay, and it occurs in many different variations of the Sicilian Defense. When you've got this pawn on c4 and this pawn on e4, that's called the Maroczy Bind formation. And it has a big, strong grip on the d5 square. Okay, and it's a standard line of play in the accelerated dragon. Okay, the main line that we played continued bishop g7, which notice threatens to capture my knight here on d4. So the standard way to deal with that is to develop the bishop to e3 to protect it. Then my opponent plays knight to f6, hitting my pawn on e4, and I guard it with knight to c3. And I really do like this Maroczy Bind formation. It gives me more space. I find it very comfortable to play. So I like when my knight is behind my c-pawn. Now in this position, my opponent played a very unusual move, but let's look at some of the alternatives. I think the main way to play is simply to castle and continue on with development. White can play bishop to e2 here. It's a good square for the bishop. It protects this g4 square from a potential knight landing there later on, especially after d6 with the bishop pointed at that square as well. Also, it's not a good idea usually to play bishop d3 with this knight sitting on d4 because you just broke your protection of the queen here. You interfered with that protection. So you play your bishop to e2, and then black often plays d6, white castles. Black might develop his bishop to d7, white pushes the queen, connects the rooks. And here's a typical formation as well, pointing the queen and dark squared bishop at the h6 square. Sometimes white likes to play bishop to h6 and trade off these bishops, weakening the dark squares around the black king. And this is a standard way to play the accelerated dragon. Now backing up, another option black has besides castling that I don't often see when I face this opening is knight to g4. Kind of a strange looking move. The knight is unprotected there, but the point is you just unleashed your bishop. And so if white takes that knight, it's really just a trade. Black will get your knight back. This is a standard way to play, though. White doesn't want to continue the trades. He really doesn't want to play bishop takes d4 and give up the bishop for the knight. Black now has the bishop pair in an open situation. Also, he's threatening to ruin the structure here on c3. So that position would slightly favor black. So instead of capturing on d4, the standard move is actually to retreat the queen back to d1 and attack it again. And then there's a few things black can do here. I suppose he could guard the knight with e5, but that gives a big hole in black's position here for white to occupy. That doesn't look so good to me. So instead, black usually retreats his knight, and you can retreat it either to c6 or e6. It's actually almost 3 times as popular for masters to retreat it to e6. I'm not exactly sure why. It doesn't look great there blocking the e-pawn, especially with the white bishop controlling all of these squares that knight can go to. But I'm sure there are some deeper reasons I'm not seeing. Okay, I'd probably move it back to c6. Leave my e-pawn mobile and help control these squares here. All right, so backing up in this position, like I said, 2 very common moves are castles or knight to g4. A third common move, by the way, the third most common move is just to keep developing with d6, get this bishop out. And there are a lot of transpositions possible with black castling, putting the bishop on d7, and both sides just continue to develop. But my opponent played a very strange move in this position. I don't really recommend this move, queen to a5. Okay. Sometimes that move comes in handy if white has a piece over here on g5 that the queen is hitting. It does pin the knight here on c3, and it makes a threat. The threat is knight takes e4. But white has the move I played, knight b3, hitting the queen, making it move. Okay. And in this position, it's probably best just to either move it back to d8 or to c7. But my opponent posted it in the center of the board, e5, which is probably not terrible if that queen gets harassed. I guess it always has the c7 square here. I made an inferior move, I think, in this position. Black was threatening my e4 pawn, and so I have to do something about that. I didn't want to protect it with f3. It looked a little weakening here. I want to castle kingside. But when you have a bishop on e3 here, you do very often play f3, and you feel kind of safe because the bishop is doing its job protecting you along that dark squared diagonal. And after you castle kingside, you can even tuck your king into the corner. So that was a possible way to play, which also has the benefit of stopping the knight from coming to g4. Another way to play is more aggressively with f4, hitting the queen, and maybe even threatening f5 later for an attack. Okay, but I played the much more conservative bishop to d3. So I mentioned earlier not to make that move in favor of bishop to e2, but this time there's no knight on d4 to worry about. So that's a possible move to protect the pawn, but it's a little passive with the bishop facing these pawns here. Okay, that's as far as I want to take us through this opening, especially down this line, since this move queen to a5 is such a rare move in this position. It's good to know about the accelerated dragon. It's good to know about this little tactic here. And there are a lot of transpositions possible. All right, thanks for